Hey, everybody, this is Nevin Gusak, your host of the Populist Patriot. With me tonight is a gentleman who we've been trying to get on for a while, and he's a very special guest, a very fascinating guest, Seven Surack. Seven Surack used to be one of the, I guess you could say, recruiters or field representatives for the conservative, libertarianish organization called Turning Point USA, which is quite often in the news as supporters of, well, latecomers or post 2016 supporters of Donald Trump. And he's a very prolific figure on various campuses and news media outlets that is the founder and leader of Turning Point, Charlie Kirk. Many of you have probably heard of the organization as well as Charlie Kirk. Well, right now we're going to have Seven Surack. He became disillusioned with much of Turning Point's program, and we wanted him to join this show to talk about his path to becoming disillusioned with the ideology of groups like Turning Point USA and what he believes now, and also a discussion about the issues of the day that our country is facing. How you doing, Seven?
Hey, I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. Had a great day today. Enjoyed day with my daughter. Got new glasses. Going standoff paddleboarding tomorrow. And then my girlfriend is coming for a show next weekend. I'm very, very happy right now.
Right on. I appreciate you having me.
Appreciate you being on. So let's start out a little bit in an introduction to yourself. If you could tell me a bit about when appropriate, your professional background, where you're from, and how you developed first into a libertarian leaning conservative. Let's start with those two things.
Okay, yeah. So just, a little bit of background about me. I was born in Youngstown, Ohio, the wonderful industrial hellhole in Northeast Ohio. But I grew up in Kokomo, Indiana, just kind of a small town in central Indiana. That's where I went to high school. Later attended college at Indiana University, Kokomo, which tip for anybody who's thinking about going into college or, hasn't gone in yet. If you can go to a community college satellite of a state school, right, like IU, for example, you can get a good state school education for less than $50,000. Little sidebar right there. So while I was in college studying communication, I sort of got involved with this group called Young Americans for Liberty. And a little bit of the ideological background. I've always been an anti-authoritarian in a sense. I don't like the idea of, people telling other people what to do and of, specifically the powerful bossing around the powerless. And at the time, the sort of pro-freedom, pro-individual liberty rhetoric of libertarianism and conservatives really drew me in. So I began my political career with YAL, Young Americans for Liberty, just like as a chapter president, like as a volunteer, start a chapter on my campus, do, little events, like we did like a pro-marijuana legalization debate, like free speech demonstrate, stuff like that, real basic stuff. Got involved with the Howard County GOP as like an intern, did that for a couple years. And then when I graduated, I found a job with this organization called the Leadership Institute. I want to ask, have you heard of the Leadership Institute?
As a matter of fact, not only I've heard of Leadership Institute, I met Mort Blackwell back in, I think, 1990, late 1990s, and I went to their seminar, and I still have the certificate in one of my file boxes.
So, you went to the leadership school?
Yeah, I went to one of their seminars in the late 1990s. Yep, and I met Mort Blackwell, and I talked with him.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Yeah, so you know exactly what you were there in Clarendon, right, in Virginia?
Well, no, it was a seminar actually that they held. Oh. If I recall correctly, it was in Miami, Florida. It was on political campaigning. It was an all-day event with only a couple of breaks in between. And I think they catered in lunch, if I remember correctly.
Okay, yeah. They do those. They do all their seminars like out in the field as well as like at headquarters. and not to get too far into it, but I ended up going to the headquarters in Virginia, where they actually have dorms like in the basement of the building. So I was there for 2 weeks doing, exactly what you're talking about, where I think the first 2 days were about 14 to 16 hours each.
Mm-hmm.
So we'd start at 8 a.m. and go till, 2 a.m. And then they would give us homework, right? So we'd be there in the dorms at 2 in the morning trying to do this homework to be back at it at 8 a.m. the next day. Just to kind of give people an idea of what it was like. The dorms, if you've ever been in like an army barracks where it's just one big room with a bunch of bunk beds in it and like public shower stall, like restroom things, that was sort of, very Spartan accommodations, so to speak. Anyways, so I did that. I was involved with them for a while. That was my first like real entrance into the political world, doing the field rep thing. And the thing with the Leadership Institute, for the viewers that may not be aware of it or what it is, this is one of the lesser known sort of behind the scenes organizations that really, it's an engine for the wider conservative movement, because it works with all of them. It works with Young Americans for Liberty, Students for Life, Turning Point USA, Young America's Foundation. If you name a conservative organization, the Leadership Institute works with them.
Mm-hmm.
So I was sort of like a traveling salesman for every single conservative organization you could possibly think of. They would just give you like a giant, box or like bag of brochures from every single different organization. And, going onto a college campus, you could start a pro-life group, you could start a pro-gun group, you could start and not that I ever did this, but theoretically you could start an anti-China group, you name it. If it fits into this sort of, like you said, like this wider fusionist conservative movement, you could be involved with it. So that was a short-term contract gig. Did it for 3 months. Didn't make very good money because, if you've ever been an independent contractor, you know that all of your expenses come right out of your pocket. So like if you have to be on the road, if you have to get hotel rooms, if you have to buy materials, it all comes right out of your paycheck. And then you pay all of your taxes at the end of the year. So, I walked away from that with like maybe $3,000 total. Anyways, I'm maybe rambling a little bit. So I got involved with Turning Point USA after that. And it was basically the same thing. You travel around to college campuses, you find interested students and help them start a group. I did a lot of like big events. We had Nigel Farage come. I gave his introduction. That's somewhere floating around on YouTube. If anyone wants to find it, just look up Nigel Farage at Lock Haven University. That's in Pennsylvania. I had Sargon of Akkad. I think his name's like Carl Benjamin or something. Charlie Kirk obviously came through at Penn State. He came with Don Jr. That was one of our biggest events. There were like thousands of students there, which in retrospect is very surprising. I couldn't imagine being like 20 and being like, oh man, we're going to go see Don Jr. and Charlie Kirk tonight. I mean, that just doesn't make sense to me, but hey, whatever. So yeah, I did that for about 2 years. And then 2020 is really where the ideological shift started for me, because I had always been more of a I guess like a different type of conservative, right? More like a libertarian in a sense. Like I was always like pro Black Lives Matter in the sense that I understood their message and I thought it was a good one. The organization itself, their tactics, I mean, we can have a discussion about whether those are appropriate, but overall, I agreed with the message. I was never very religious. I was very like pro criminal justice reform, pro drug legalization. Like I said, it's kind of a different kind of conservative, but I was always very right wing economically, right? That's what libertarians are. They give up the social stuff in return for being way, way, way more to the right than even, a lot of staunch Republicans. I mean, there's, libertarians that unironically want to bring back child labor. I mean, you see these arguments.
Oh, sure. A number of Libertarian Institute, Carl Hassani and others. I mean, the Ludwig von Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama, the Rothbardians, they all are pro-child labor. They think it's a bad thing that we had child labor laws that were passed during the New Deal. Yeah, they have all kinds of, let's just say, interesting arguments. What was your position on foreign policy and national security? I assume it was non-interventionist or anti-interventionist, since you're associated with YAL and the more right libertarian camp. What was your position on that at the time?
Yeah, very anti-interventionist. I mean, the way I always looked at it, and again, this strikes me as being more pragmatic than ideological, is just that if we weren't directly attacked by another sovereign nation, I don't think that we should have boots on the ground in said sovereign nation. And there are arguments to be made about, like, X country harbored this stateless group of, radicals or terrorists or what have you. But at the same time, just the destruction and the devastation and the long-term effects of our occupation of really any country, going all the way back to Vietnam, I would say. I mean, there's an argument to be made that we bombed Korea into the Stone Age, like North Korea, but I don't. That's a long discussion. I don't know a lot about it, so we'll just say Vietnam.
Mhm.
Um, it's just not. It's never been worth it, in my opinion. Purely from the conservative small government standpoint, I never understood why members of the Republican Party would be pro-war, right? Because it balloons the national debt. War is one of those times where people are more willing to give up individual liberties. The state grows. It just never struck me as being particularly ideologically consistent. In 1,000 words, yes, I was anti-interventionist.
Okay, so what caused you in 2020 to rethink your libertarian conservative views, your fusionist ideology, if you will? What did you see around you happen? Or what did you see going on in Turning Point USA that may have turned you off? Of course, if there might be things you have to keep confidential. So we respect that on this show. We don't want to pressure you in any means. So feel free to reveal whatever you're allowed to reveal, or whatever you're comfortable revealing about the organization. And of course, tell me more about your personal ideological changes and what led you on. What did you see in the United States, your community, and elsewhere going on that basically had you repudiating the ideology as represented by groups like Turning Point USA?
Yeah, absolutely. As far as confidentiality goes, it's funny. The day after I gave that majority report call, sort of quasi interview thing, my old boss, because I had already quit Turning Point by that point, my old boss called me and threatened to sue me for talking about working at Turning Point. And I mean, I knew it was a bluff because, I never signed anything that said I couldn't talk about my time there. But just, fun little sidebar about that. They've already threatened to sue me, and that was like a year ago. So I'm not worried about it. But 2020, I would say it started with George Floyd being murdered. Well, it goes back further than that, but that's like the main sort of point that I'm going to talk
Well, what were
about.
the things that what was the predating the murder of George Floyd? What were the things that started to chip away at? If you could mention it briefly and work our way up to George Floyd and
Yeah. Okay. So it really centers around like the police, right? And, conversations about criminal justice reform. Yeah, actually, that's like the central thing. I mean, there were incidents prior to George Floyd where, it was very obvious that, the individual was, murdered by the police. We're talking about, Breonna Taylor, Elijah McClain, even as far back as Philando Castile. There's plenty of examples. And, I'm a very vocal person, so I would post about it on Facebook. I'd say, oh, this is messed up. We need to do something about this, blah, blah, blah. I would sort of take pot shots, you know, maybe at the police or at the system or whatever. And at a certain point, my boss called me and said that higher ups at Turning Point didn't like the things that they were seeing on my Facebook, and that, you know, they would like me to stop posting about it. Actually, funny story. Charlie Kirk has such a thin skin that I posted one meme where it was like Charlie being wrong on one minor point of contention, like one little Twitter interaction where Charlie was wrong about something. They specifically asked me to remove that one. Like I was essentially forced to delete that post. So that's really where it started, was clashes about like my public ideological views. And then going forward to George Floyd, this was one of those things where I would think that any reasonable, emotionally, you know, sensitive person would put aside their ideological affiliations. They would take off their red and blue jerseys, put them to the side, and say, all right, this is wrong. You know, we should all kind of come together and, you know, show our support and try to do something about this. That was what I expected. What I got was a doubling down of, you know, he was a criminal, he deserved all this like really horrible stuff about a guy who was murdered over ostensibly a counterfeit $20 bill. I mean, that's kind of still, I think, up in the air, but we'll just say it was a counterfeit $20 bill. The conservative movement just doubled down in their opposition to Black Lives Matter. I mean, it got to the, you know, talking about they need to be shooting these protesters, people should run them over, you know, all this really horrible stuff that I think really exposed just their total lack of like a moral compass, like as a movement or as a group. And that was where it really started. Like I started to have real misgivings about it. And then continuing into 2020 with the pandemic, and this is something that I really haven't even fully worked out myself, but I'll just kind of give my best approximation. The pandemic exposed the realities of our economic and political systems, right? I mean, there's all this like fluff that's kind of built up on top of reality that obfuscates the real relationships between things. And I've always said that there's this ideological like wiggle room that exists where you can say that, like, for example, like cutting taxes on the rich benefits everybody, right? Like that's not true, but in normal times, there's this like little space ideologically that you can exist in that allows you to believe that and just dismiss any evidence to the contrary. I think that's where most conservatives kind of live, is like in that ideological space. But the pandemic got rid of all that. The pandemic, you know, exposed the reality of the system, and it showed me that the people who really make the economy and society function, these essential workers, so to speak, they're the ones who get the most raw deal out of, you know, almost anybody in society. We bend over backwards for people who have more money than any human being could ever spend in their lifetime.
On this show, by the way, not to interrupt, you could say that they're collectively shit on by the 1% and the much of the representatives. It's okay to say it.
Okay. Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah.
And I wanted to make you laugh a little bit, so got to.
No, you're good. So yeah, and that was like, and it was everything, right? It was that. Okay, because the pandemic was another example of something where it's like, okay, take off the team jerseys, right? Stop being a Republican or a Democrat and start being someone who is going to pragmatically face this problem head on and do what's necessary to take care of it. One example, I mean, I'm not an expert on this or anything, but I think one thing we could have done to keep businesses functioning, at least throughout the pandemic, even if they had to be closed, was a temporary, I use the word nationalization, but that's not totally accurate. Temporary nationalization of paychecks, of payroll. So basically, like
Germany, they did that in the Federal Republic of Germany.
Yeah, okay, exactly. So every business submits, you know, maybe their accounting or whatever to the government and says, look, this is how much we pay our employees every month. And the government says, all right, cool, we're going to match that. We're going to pay your employees what they normally make until you can reopen. And that would have been, I think, the pragmatic solution. But because of ideology, I mean, hell, you didn't even have any of the Democrats really suggesting that I'm aware of.
No, in
And
fact,
so,
House Leadership Pelosi actually put means testing on the occasional stimulus checks. So, but
right,
that,
exactly.
yeah, no, it's very the way the Democrats, but more so the Republicans and a lot of the corporate Democrats handled the pandemic was atrocious. It was an embarrassment to the country for in so many levels. Go ahead. I had to interject there. Sorry.
No, you're right on the money with that. That's exactly what it was. It was not only an embarrassment, but to me, it was a repudiation of our system, of our economic and political system. It was showing that, I mean, let's be honest, okay? The pandemic has killed a lot of people, and it's an absolute tragedy, and it's horrible, and not to make light of it, but this was not as bad as it could have been, right? This was, I think, in the grand scheme, historically, relatively minor stress placed on a political and economic system. Now, again, not to discount the death and the devastation, and it's a tragedy, but at the same time, it was not as a society-ending, global You know what I'm trying to say here, right? It just wasn't as bad as we initially maybe thought it was going to be, and yet we still couldn't function. We couldn't meet it properly. I mean, we're still dealing with this now. It's October of 2021, and cases are still, we're still having this conversation about like vaccinations and all this stuff. But the main point is just that was like the big breaking point for me, was seeing that Republicans specifically just like they let all this ideological stuff get in the way of doing what was right for people, for their constituents, for the country, and to some extent the world, right? Because we live in this interconnected global structure, and things that happen in America do affect the rest of the world. They just completely dropped the ball. And there's a difference, I think, between dropping the ball because you made a mistake, and then there's a difference between that and deliberately dropping the ball. And they deliberately dropped it. They said, well, we could do all of this stuff, but it's not going to benefit our rich donors, so we're not going to do it. And that was, Trump pretending the pandemic didn't exist, just all of it. Like the collective response that the whole conservative movement had to the killing of George Floyd and the pandemic and the protests during the summer, everything that happened in 2020 was a wake-up call that the things I was pushing for, the agenda that I was a part of, was harmful. It was not good for anybody. And the thing is that, and I think this is true of a lot of people, the real reason that a lot of people get involved in politics is this idealistic sense of wanting to make the world a better place. And that's what I had. I genuinely thought that the Republican Libertarian sort of agenda was the way to make people's lives better and improve society. And 2020 showed me that it's, in fact, the exact opposite of that. It makes life worse for everybody except 0.01% of every human being who's ever, who's alive on Earth right now. So that's the best summation I can give, is that the reality of what happened in 2020 completely decimated any illusion I had about the the efficacy and the morality of the Republican sort of way of looking at the world.
Yeah, I mean, and my path, I mean, it's very hard to really concisely explain my disillusionment with Reaganism, but I guess it would come down to their stance on economics, particularly on trade issues, and their apologia for the outsourcing of our production, therefore harming our national security. National security and domestic security always have been very big issues of mine. And the other issue is just the hypocrisy of conservatism. I think the conservative ideology of, entrepreneurialism, self-sufficiency, strong national security, patriotism, I think it's good in itself when properly handled and
Right.
addressed. Is good. It's noble. It's great, wonderful, terrific, fine. But the problem is that you can have tight, small communities where people are self-sufficient and low or no drug use or fewer abortions or no abortions when you have an economic system that spits on the notion of community. In libertarian economic theory, which I've read about and I used to adhere to, is replete with basically a repudiation of the idea of nation and community, and they will say that explicitly. Some of them, even like Ludwig von Mises in his 1920s, called for world government. And I think Frederick Hayek to some degree too at one point or another, to give you some examples. And
Not
then,
to sorry to interrupt you, but I think was it Rothbard who said that people should be able to sell their children? I think.
yes. Rothbard was a psycho, and he
Yeah.
also felt that the collapse of the Saigon government in South Vietnam was a liberation in 1975. Rothbard felt that the Soviet Union during this open Cold War period, because on this show specifically me, we feel that the Cold War never ended, that the Russians repositioned themselves ideologically but continued the same pursuit of overturning the United States. And Rothbard was always a lot of libertarians were very much apologists for the Deng Xiaoping and his successors' economic system in communist China. There was a big turnoff. I mean, people like Justin Raimondo, they were championing and apologizing for the worst expansionist dictatorships that were part of the anti-American alliance. And then when you look at just them complaining about socialism in general, it seems like they're against socialism when it affects their rich donors, but when there's money to be made with doing business with the socialist or collectivist, fascist or Islamic dictatorship, then all of a sudden, everything's okay. We're got to make some money, under the guise, these governments will liberalize, we trade with them. And that's never happened. The United States, France, and Great Britain traded with National Socialist Germany. And Hitler said to his top comrades he wanted to bomb the gold hyenas in Paris, London, and New York. Not very pro-capitalist. Give me a break. And they all kept on trading with him until Paris and London were bombed. Oops, I guess he was a bad guy. And then certain industrialists from Germany, some of them fled and spoke out quietly, saying it's basically hellhole here. We're controlled and make tons of profit, but it's taxed away. And, we have the Gestapo spying us. But the point being is that I started to get very disillusioned with them. I started to listen to progressive nationalist talk show hosts like John Sly Sylvester up in Wisconsin, Tom Hartman. And while there are things I vigorously disagree with them on various issues, I think after just doing research on who gets what money, I think a lot of that controlled that. And when I started to study Leninist international political theory, Lenin's debates on the concessions for foreign corporations in the early 20s, reading Communist Party newspapers like Workers' World and CPUSA Political Affairs, you will find and open statements by leaders, defectors from communist and Islamic dictatorships. They'll all talk about how the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, will sell the rope to hang themselves. And it's happened over and over again. I've written books about this, as a matter of fact, available on Amazon.com. So, and Thomas Frank, the political commentator, the progressive populist political commentator, said it best, and let me see if I can find it. If you guys, all you in the audience, bear with me, I will be forever and eternally grateful, because this crystallizes really what so-called Reaganite modern fusionist conservatism is all about. So let me just get this here. Thomas Frank. Thank God for Microsoft Word. I could always find my things here. This is from my latest book, Turning the Page, My Evolution from Conservatism to Radical Civic Nationalism. So here in my book, I write, progressive author and commentator Thomas Frank wrote that since conservatism viewed capitalism as carrying, quote, within it the spark of the divine, the, quote, interests of business are central in defining, while every other aspect or strategy of the movement is mutable and disposable. Patriotism is a virtue under all circumstances until the time comes to declare the nation state a relic of the protectionist past. Even communism itself becomes perfectly acceptable when, as in Red China, it mutates into a way of enforcing market discipline. The needs of business stand like a rock. All else is convenience, opportunism, a bit of bourgeois, meaning bullshit, that's an old-fashioned way of saying it. Yes, we do curse on the show sometimes. Generated by some focus group session and forgotten the instant it is no longer convincing. Fundamentally amoral, capitalism is loyal to no people, no region, no heroes, really, once they have exhausted their usefulness, not even to the nation whose flag they pretend to worship. And that is like the perfect crystallization, the perfect explanation of modern conservatism, because it's really not conserving anything but it's private sector oligarchs. So when I started to read this and started to really research this from a national security perspective, that of a strong patriotism, I just got turned off and I felt the need to speak out. So I wrote books on Amazon. I was interviewed on Cliff Kincaid's America Survival. He was associated with Accuracy Media. Him and I and Tina Trent, who is basically a defector, if you will, from Americans for Prosperity. She's very paleo-conservative, but she opposes openly the Koch brothers. She says the Americans for Prosperity was just as corrupt as the Southern Poverty Law Center. That's pretty bad when you say that. That really is bad. So, so I've been on different outlets, Jaron Nyquist, and others, where I was permitted to make certain criticisms of conservatism because they felt it was a big story what I had. Because nobody talks about what we're talking about or what I talk about. And there is some movement in the conservative movement. There is a push to adopt a more serious form of civic nationalism and populism. It's a conference I'm going to in 2 weeks called the National Conservatism Conference, where you have Julius Krein of American Affairs, Warren Cass of American Compass, and others. And they're trying to break from this sort of neoliberal agenda. Rod Dreyer of the American Conservative, which is another, they've had some great articles on economy, as well as on the need for the conservative case for single-payer health care. They've run that article a few times. So, I started to look at really the history of conservatism. There were many strands of conservatism that in some cases even opposed Reagan. People like Anthony Harrigan and William R. Hawkins, they wrote essays that were critical of aspects of Reagan's financial deregulation and lack of antitrust enforcement and his free trade policies. So, I started to really look at the Reagan record, and this originally was from right-wing John Birch types who are very critical of Reagan, like Don McIlvaney and in the New American and American Opinion. And I looked at Reagan's foreign policy, was very inconsistent in dealing with the enemies of the United States. It's like on the one hand, there'll be some trade restrictions on the Soviet Union, but on the other hand, we lift the grain embargo. Reagan lifted the grain embargo on the Soviet Union, which actually fed the Red Army war machine at the same time. And we knew it at the time. And of course, we know about it today. So I look at this, there were sanctions on Sandinista Nicaragua, but yet these sanctions say more loopholes than a hunk of Swiss cheese in my refrigerator. So again, why? Because it's corporations. You have the trilateral commission types, which are your big banker Wall Street types like George Shultz and others in the administration that ordered these trade embargoes and sanctions. They whittled them away. And so I just got very disillusioned with conservatism, and eventually I call myself constitutional American nationalism. Now I call myself a radical civic nationalist. We don't like racial nationalism or racism on this show. We despise them. I mean, in my personal life, I work in an inner city library. I love it. Most of the people are of color. I love the staff. They're like a third family for me. And I date a woman. You go on my personal Facebook page. She ain't white, so I live it, so to speak. So racial nationalism is totally irrelevant to us. Not irrelevant, but it's just undesirable. And race is irrelevant in the sense that who cares? We're a nation of different colors and races, and our civic nationalism seeks to blend people together, nationalize people into this sort of not so new ideology. What I'm saying is new by today's standards, but probably would have been more acceptable back then, decades ago. When it comes to putting on the red, white, and blue jerseys, we put on the red, white, and blue jerseys. But our interpretation of that in this show is that it's kind of like a human body. I had a heart condition where I almost died from a heart attack, lost 50 pounds, I exercise, weightlift, and everything. Wearing the red, white, and blue jersey is basically not resting on your laurels and saying everything's wonderful, just like I was years ago, 200 pounds. It's saying, okay, we got a problem. We got to solve the problem stat quickly. And you got to, and to me, wearing a red, white, and blue jersey means, as a nationalist, is not accepting things for what they are if they're wrong, but it's a nation based on continuous improvement. And it's both conservative and revolutionary, what I'm saying here. Because if we don't look at our problems, look, we're very much Black Lives Matter. I have issues with their economic ideology. One of their heads saying they're trained Marxists, them having close ties to Cuba and Venezuela, accepting the Venezuelan elections, which were rigged. People can debate it on the left and right if they want. And that kind of thing. Okay, and this is one of the reasons why I harshly oppose the left. But fundamentally, regarding extreme inequality and still racial divides, they're correct. And it's an issue that needs to be dealt with properly. And our nation really is not dealing with the root structural causes of a lot of our social maladies. So if you want to get rid of radicalism, you have to do what things like FDR and Bismarck did, and address the problems and implement fundamental social reforms without throwing away the very best that our system has to offer. So that's how I evolved in my ideology, in my worldview. I used to be a knee-jerk conservative, used to blame the liberals for everything, putting the country in the shitter and the toilet bowl and all the rest of it. But now we're on this show, we're very transpartisan. So what do you think about what I have to say? And after you give your thoughts about what I have to say, what are your thoughts about, what do you recollect about when you described your feelings about the murder of George Floyd, the general police brutality, as well as abuses that elements of the police engage in, as well as the economic failure during COVID? Did you talk to your supervisors as well as fellow Turning Point USA people about what you're thinking and, hey, this is not working and maybe we got to shift our ideology, like adopt a different form of capitalism, or have a strong police force, but at the same time maybe recruiting police from the communities who know each other's neighbors and therefore hopefully has more of a sensitivity towards the community or whatnot, or engage, if the police officers actually engaged in bona fide unnecessary abuse, like prosecuting them. Do you ever share these ideas with your colleagues in Turning Point USA? And if so, what was their reaction? Did anybody change their mind or quietly say, yeah, you're right, but we're really not supposed to talk about this? What happened?
Okay, so I'll start with, like you said, kind of my thoughts on like your, I guess, development ideologically. I mean, to me, it's almost hard to put into words sometimes, but I think that the rhetoric that is used by conservatives is really powerful, right? This free, like pro freedom, individual liberties, etc. And it's very attractive to, a person like yourself that, again, like genuinely cares about doing what's right and, making the world a better place than it is today. And so, it really, but at the same time, it contains almost like the seed of its own destruction, like this ideology, as in, the case again of someone like you and, to like someone like me, where that same force that drove you to side with conservatives in the first place is the same force that over time and over sort of repeated examples of these individuals like Reagan or his administration or similar individuals like continuously fail to live up to their own purported beliefs, right? And so I think it's a natural progression to over time go from as long as you're honest with yourself and honest about what is right and what's wrong, that you would go from, again, being someone who's a conservative to being someone who, I mean, you call yourself a radical civic nationalist, but if you were to ask somebody, say you just find some random red meat Republican and you describe your beliefs to them and you say, what would you call this person? I mean, 7 out of 10 shot, they call you a communist. Even though that's not true, obviously, that's just sort of like that weird ideological bubble that they live in. So
why would they call me a communist? Because precisely one of the core missions of one of the reasons why I fought, well, not fought, but created the Populist Patriot is because I am concerned about the growth of various communist parties, the growth of Russia and China. I'm very vigorous in my disagreement, and I have, I think, embarrassed some people who say, well, you're a communist. Well, take a look at my books on Amazon.com. Yeah, shut up. I've written lots of anti-communist stuff that are probably more anti-communist than your supposed anti-communist. Why would some ideological dolt call me a communist?
I would think that there's two main reasons. One is that, for lack of a better term, the current conservative ideology is not super coherent, right? Like it's not. It's piecemeal, right? Like they sort of have these beliefs, but from one day to the next, their beliefs will manifest themselves in different ways, in totally contradictory ways. I'm trying to think of an example. But I mean, I can't really think of a good example of that right now, but obviously you know what I'm talking about. And the second reason is because of the phenomenon known as the Overton window, right? Which is that, are you familiar with that concept?
Well, explain it for the audience.
Okay, yeah, sure. So the Overton window, for lack of a better term, if you imagine a political spectrum with 2 points on it, one point being like far left and the other point being far right. If you were to take a little snapshot of a portion of that spectrum, so say you were to, I don't know, just take like a snapshot of the middle. The right is more towards that right end of the spectrum and the left is more towards that left end of the spectrum. But because you can only see a portion of the total political spectrum, or we can only sort of talk about a portion of that total political spectrum at one time, if a person on the right believes that, for example, lower taxes on the rich lead to more prosperity, any opinion to the left of that belief is going to seem, how do I put this? Like, all right, so lower taxes on the rich benefit all of society. If you were to be as far away from that belief as you possibly could, like saying, for example, that actually higher taxes on the rich, benefit everybody relative to the total like spectrum that we're viewing at the time, you can seem either moderate or even like a radical left. I'm probably not explaining it very well, But you kind of get what I'm saying in the sense.
Today, as things have become so polarized and there's such orthodoxies, let's say in the so-called conservative camp, that any independent thinking or nuance is considered automatically communist. James Burnham, who is a former Trotskyite communist and an active one and a leader of those movements, who became a conservative and a mainstay in National Review, he actually criticized the reactionary businessmen at the time who would conflate your liberals and social democrats with communism. And he identified that problem back then. Whittaker Chambers a little bit did too as well. He criticized what he termed know-nothing conservatism when referring to people like Ayn Rand. So I think that's what it is. And I think that kind of know-nothing conservatism and that sort of reactionary globalist business ideology unfortunately has become the mainstay of the conservative movement. I suspect that's what you're trying to say. And they enforce it in such a Politburo type of way that there has to be discipline. And there were purges in the conservative movement. You look at what happened with Pat Buchanan in the 1990s on his issues of economics, and particularly on trade protectionism. And you look at others, there is a viciousness in conservative movements. Look at what happened with Bruce Bartlett. Bruce Bartlett, who worked in the Reagan administration, was one of the architects of trickle-down economics. He repudiated it. And now he's a very vitriolic opponent of trickle-down economics and the whole low tax thing, even though he adopted it. And you listen to interviews, he used to be friends with Grover Norquist and Stephen Moore and all these other people. They used to go to each other's houses and have, see each other's kids and go to parties together, blah, 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 blah. But when he publicly opposed them, it was like the Furies were let upon him. All the friends disappeared and everything else. A lot of it comes down to, I think, ideology and money. I think that's what it is. What are your thoughts?
Just to kind of save my own street cred, the best way to describe what I was trying to talk about is that a society exists on that spectrum, like either more towards the left or more towards the right. So our society exists more towards the right end of the political spectrum. And so someone who in reality on the total spectrum is only like a moderate, like they're in the middle, they seem like a radical leftist because the societal window of political ideology is so far to one end that, being in the middle makes you seem like you're 3 miles to the left of the given society. That's the best way to describe it.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yes, because our elite consensus opinion has shifted to the so-called right with the neoliberal consensus. Yes, you're absolutely right. Whereas somebody like me, my co-host, him and I were talking last night privately, and he said, Nevin, you're actually an actual moderate, not like a Joe Manchin or Kristen Sinema moderate, because they're not moderates. They're about as moderate as I am a communist.
Right.
I am truly a moderate of the old New Deal school, if you will. During the golden age of the United States and the golden age of capitalism. So now I apologize for butchering what you were saying.
No, I butchered it. It's fine.
No, you explained it perfectly at the end of basis. But do you ever discuss this with your colleagues in Turning Point USA and share your thoughts? Because you were friends with a lot of these people, if I recall correctly.
Oh, yeah. And also, I hate to do this. I just got a text message. I have sort of an unforeseen family thing come up. So I've got like 7 to 10 minutes and then I have to go. So I apologize for that, but it was last minute. I did talk to my colleagues about a lot of this stuff. In fact, at a lot of these conferences that we would go to, I would get into rather heated arguments with people about things like foreign policy or drug legalization. One example I remember very vividly was talking about Black Lives Matter, just the general concept of like criminal justice reform and that kind of stuff. And it got to the point where one of my like good friends at the organization was like hurling insults at me, and uh, just being like interpersonally rude to me over a political disagreement. And I'll be honest, I was rude back, because I don't react well to that kind of thing. If someone gives me shit, I'm going to give it back to them, double usually. That's just kind of the person I am. And it resulted in like, an actual conflict within the organization where there were sort of several people that agreed with me, and there were several people that agreed with this other person, and none of us talked to each other for about a month. And then finally, at one of the conferences, we sort of appointed an intermediary, and then we're able to kind of work out our differences, basically by just saying like, we all have our individual beliefs, but the people that pay Charlie Kirk, who in turn pays us, they're the only ones whose opinions about this stuff really matter. And that actually brings up something that I've always thought about Turning Point, is that Charlie Kirk gets to have all kinds of sort of interesting positions for a conservative. If you like kind of pay attention to the things that he says once in a while, you'll be like, wait, that's not really what a conservative is supposed to think or supposed to say. And the reason is because Charlie Kirk is nothing but a figurehead, in the sense that he's allowed to think that we should legalize marijuana. He's allowed to think that, we should pull out of wherever, Afghanistan or Iraq or whatever, because he'll never be at the levers of power. That's not his job. His job is to recruit foot soldiers or, acolytes for the people who really will be at the levers of power through, donations to politicians, et cetera. I mean, trying to think of some of the big name donors. The Home Depot guy, the CEO of Home Depot, is a big Turning Point.
Bernie Marcus.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Sheldon Adelson was a big donor. I think he's dead now.
Sheldon Adelson died.
Foster Freeze. Yep. Bill Montgomery. I met him several times. He worked for Nixon. He worked for Nixon back in the day, and was basically Charlie's like right-hand guy, or probably the other way around in reality, where, Bill Montgomery was the real brains and wallet behind the operation. But anyways, to kind of sum up my answer to your question, yes, I did talk to my colleagues about it, and a lot of them agreed with me. Even my direct supervisor agreed with me about a lot of the economic points during the coronavirus, like as far as how we should be helping small businesses, how we should be, giving direct payments to people, etc. The problem is that it's an AstroTurf organization, and in AstroTurf organizations, the rank and file membership has zero say over the kind of ideas that they push. Real quick sidebar. I've been to the Turning Point headquarters in Phoenix, Arizona. It's right across the street from the Arizona Grand Resort there in Phoenix, if you know where that is. And funny story, you walk into the building and you go into this big main room, and the carpet in the main room is AstroTurf. I am not joking. I swear to God. I went in there, and this was when I was starting to have these misgivings. This was like August of 2020, which, funny story, they brought us to Arizona during the pandemic, like at the height of it, stuck us all in a room with, no masks or any requirement to do anything, and then sent us out to college campuses. But yeah, and that's what makes me think that like people like Charlie Kirk and the upper echelon of Turning Point, they know what this is. They know what they're doing. They know that they're an AstroTurf, sort of like dark money organization. And they were having a little tongue-in-cheek joke by, carpeting the room with literal AstroTurf.
I'm sure the irony was not lost on them, and I'm sure at least, well, obviously not you, and perhaps maybe some of the other quiet dissidents within the organization. I mean, this is really fascinating discussion that we're having. I know you mentioned you had a family emergency. Would you be willing to come on perhaps another weekend, maybe next weekend or the following weekend, to do a show?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll work on getting, because I'm not sure what the format of your show is exactly, but I'll work on getting a video kind of thing set up so that hopefully it can be visual as well as audio. I just got a microphone and like set up for recording and podcasting, but I just haven't gotten a camera yet.
Yeah, I have to get a microphone, and I have to get some equipment too as well, because we got 435 subscribers to the channel.
Very nice.
If you feel comfortable once this interview is uploaded, if you feel free to share this interview, share the program. We're an politically eclectic group. I don't know what you would term my political belief systems, but I've been called unique, having a unique point of view, myself and my co-hosts. And there needs to be more alternative voices out there, more discussions, more education to kind of counter the neoliberal market fundamentalist narrative that is the establishment. So what I really want to discuss is pick your brain further about the issues, where you've gone, where you see yourself politically now, if you're going to continue to evolve politically, and really, how do we really keep dark money propaganda organizations like Turning Point USA, how are we going to get them to be accountable? Because they are selling, in part, ideological swill, in my opinion. There are certainly grains of truth. In this show and Turning Point, we agree with capitalism and private property, but we have very different interpretations of what form that system should take. To give you an example, we have diametrically opposed. So I'd like to talk about how you would address the irresponsibility of these dark money political organizations, propaganda fronts, etc., and where you stand on the issues now. So I'm thinking probably maybe we can get in touch privately and or talk about it off the show for a few minutes and nail down maybe a date and time for this coming week, perhaps.
Yeah, that sounds good. Just shoot me a message, and then yeah, actually, if you're in the market for, we'll talk about this off the air, but I have a couple suggestions, like the microphone I just got and some other like software that might help you out in your endeavors.
Perfect. Okay, let me stop this interview. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Seven, for joining us. We'll talk
no problem
for a few minutes. This has been a great interview. You're a funny guy. I like to make you laugh too. Hopefully we'll have a little more laughter in the show, because we're a fun group of people, and I'm a fun boss to work with. So in my real job, so it's always important to laugh, but get the work done. Alrighty, so I'm gonna stop the interview. Have a good night, everyone. God bless. Be safe. Be healthy. Take care and enjoy your weekend.